right. Well, appreciate the opportunity to come and speak with you all today. My colleague Crystal just came around and provided some kind of leave behinds for you all as well. We'll kind of get to that. She's very new to Bounce, so she actually preferred that I present today, and she'll kind of observe and watch for these presentations in the future. But again, my name is Carli Mosby. I am with Kentucky Youth Advocates. We serve as the backbone organization to the Bounce Coalition. And I'll talk here in a little bit more about what we do as Bounce. And I know that you all have talked a little bit today about ACEs and trauma, so I'm going to try really hard not to be redundant, because I did have a little bit in here about sort of what are ACEs, what does that look like, the prevalence wise here in Kentucky, as well as what trauma-informed care really looks like. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on the resilient side of things and the trauma-informed care side of things, since it sounds like you all have learned a little bit about that today already, and I'm sure just already know a lot about that. Anyways, so again, I heard our previous presenter talking about the original ACE study that had over 17,000 folks, participants in that original ACE study. This was back in the 90s. Now, what I will say about that study, and I'll talk a little bit more about this here in a minute, is that those participants were mostly white, middle class, and health insured folks. And so that obviously has implications on how these findings are able to be generalized across communities and across our general population. So I'll talk a little bit more about that, but just want to make a note of that because I think that's really important for folks to understand. But in that original ACE study, we found out that they found that 64% of the over 17,000 folks who participated had experienced at least one adverse childhood experience. And so that's some sort of adversity in their life. We'll go over a little bit more of what that means. Again, I'm sure you all know very well. But they also found, I think most interestingly, they found a positive correlation between that childhood adversity and some of those really long-term health and wellness impacts into adulthood. We often think of trauma as happening in the moment and some of the outcomes that occur right then, but it's really, this study really had us looking at what are some of those long-term impacts of that childhood trauma, but well into adulthood. And there were things that I think we could probably generalize, or things that we maybe already kind of knew. So correlations between adversity and maybe the emotional and social impacts of that adversity, such as correlation between ACEs and potential for alcohol, or risk for alcoholism, or risk for mental health challenges, specifically depression and anxiety into adulthood. But I think what was really eye-opening for a lot of folks was the connection that they found between adverse childhood experiences and those physical outcomes as well. So some of those long-term impacts included, physical long-term impacts included increased risk of heart disease, increased risk for obesity, even things like broken bones. So it sounds like you all learned a little bit about this in the previous presenter, but I just do want to say, before we kind of continue this, you'll probably hear me say this several times, that adversity and especially ACEs are not destiny, right? Screenings for ACEs, screenings for adversity in childhood allow us to kind of assess risk, but it does not mean that, I had 5 ACEs, these are the results of that. So I want to make sure that is, that we're very clear on that. Much like the analogy I like to use is, if I know that I have heart disease runs in my family, I know of that risk and I can do things to help mitigate my potential of having issues related to heart disease. So, that's just kind of an example. It's a good thing for us to know our numbers and to know our ACE scores, so that we can help mitigate and do some resilience building, which I'll talk a little bit more about. So these are the original 10 ACEs. There have since been more added to some expanded ACEs surveys and questionnaires, but they kind of fall into three categories: abuse, so physical, emotional, and sexual, neglect, so physical and emotional neglect, and then you have that other category which kind of falls under household dysfunction, so mental illness in the household, incarcerated caregiver, domestic violence, substance abuse from a caregiver, even things like divorce were considered adverse childhood experiences in that original study. And as we are, as I already mentioned, adverse experiences, stress, and even trauma occur in the lives of many people. We saw the prevalence in that original ACEs study, but there are mitigating factors that really can help determine the risk and the outcome for those ACEs. So things, as ACEs accumulate, the impact of that trauma increases, especially if there are these things kind of here on the right-hand side that really increase that risk. So things like those traumatic experiences are particularly adverse. They are particularly negative. And that's kind of depends on that person and what they feel is particularly adverse or negative. If those experiences happen over time, so kind of that chronic adversity over time versus just one traumatic event, that is not always the case. There are definitely instances when one very traumatic event can have very similar effects as chronic stress or adversity over a long period of time, but having that chronic adversity or chronic trauma can really increase the risk of having some of those long-term outcomes. And then especially when kids or youth aren't given, don't have access to a caring adult to really buffer that experience. A lot of research has shown that especially kids who experience adversity in adult or in childhood, if they have one trusted adult, it can really improve their outcomes well into adulthood. And then so the resulting impact of the trauma increases, obviously, with more ACEs, more traumatic events and experiences. And the really unfortunate thing with adverse childhood experiences is oftentimes they kind of, there's this interconnectivity with them, right? So if there's a parent or caregiver that's experiencing substance abuse or substance use, then they might also be experiencing at some point, incarceration, or they may also, that child might be experiencing some emotional neglect, or, so a lot of these things can really interconnect. So as one ACE happens, several ACEs can also occur, kind of increases that likelihood. So again, just want to reiterate that original ACEs study is not all encompassing. A lot of folks have really talked over the last several decades, have really talked about how it's really hard to generalize that study and what they learned to our general population. And so, new research over the last several decades has really sought to discover a couple things. One, if this is applicable across all populations. And then also, if there are more instances of adversity than just those original 10. You probably saw those original 10, and while those are significant and probably some of the most common, there are also a lot of instances of adversity that children face in our country that maybe we're not in that original 10. So they, research since then has really tried to figure out what other additional adversities might be, applicable and what their impacts are. So there have been thousands of research studies since that initial study. And those studies have confirmed those findings. So again, it's just really confirming that there is that positive that correlation between as adversity goes up, so are the risks for some of these long-term outcomes. And then they've also done these studies around the world with different cultural and ethnic groups, varied economic and educational status. So it's really allowed us to look at how this impacts various populations. And then there's also research underway to see if additional items, like I said, can really make this survey, this questionnaire, the ACEs questionnaire, more meaningful to different communities. So one of those was one of the more well-known studies was the Philadelphia Expanded ACEs study. And this, they surveyed in Philadelphia over 1,700 people. This was a much more diverse sample of folks that they studied, and they found that these 5 adverse experiences are not only common among that population, but also that there is that similar correlation between those adversities and those long-term impacts. So those include things like, let me move my little mouse here. Nope. Okay. Let me make sure. Oh, witnessing violence. So that might be within their community, within their home. I think the original ACEs study really focused on witnessing violence within the home, but this one really focused on any kind of, witnessing violence at all. Felt discrimination. So if they've ever been treated poorly or felt like they were discriminated against because of something related to their identity. Adverse neighborhood experiences. So that included things like, did your neighborhood feel safe? Did you feel like there were people in your neighborhood that you could count on, that stood up for you, that could be trusted? Bullying was considered in addition to those 10. And then also just being in foster care was also considered an adverse experience as well. So I think, the main takeaway from this and subsequent studies since the original, just that, again, whether we're looking at that original ACEs survey with 10 adverse experiences versus maybe one with an expanded one with 15, or whichever one we're looking at, these are really tools. These are not meant to be diagnostic tools. These are really meant to be tools to assess risk and help us really come with knowledge of how to address and prevent these outcomes from occurring. Well, there we go. So as I mentioned, for the first probably decade and a half since that original study happened, the focus was really on the mitigation of ACEs and how, once adversity in childhood occurs, how we can mitigate those impacts and really intervene in those ways, which is very important. We, with so many folks having experienced adversity in their childhoods, that's obviously a very important track for us to continue to go down. But there's also been in kind of the last decade and a half or so, some more folks are really trying to go upstream a little bit more and focus on prevention. So what are the causes of these adverse childhood experiences? So one piece of key research that really emerged came from Dr. Wendy Ellis, and she was really looking at some of these adverse community environments. So really trying to figure out what in our communities are driving these high prevalence, these high rates of adverse childhood experiences. So things like poverty and discrimination, poor housing quality and poor housing affordability, violence within our community are all considered predictors now of adverse childhood experiences. So, as we're continuing to dive into this work and look more upstream, we can really focus on how are we creating resilient communities and trauma-informed communities in this way. So one thing I wanted to share with you all, and it's what Crystal had passed out, another initiative that Kentucky Youth Advocates oversees is the Bloom Kentucky initiative. And this is very similar to Bounce, where Bounce is more of the practice side. Bloom Kentucky really focuses on the policy and prevention side of ACEs. So Bloom brought together over 30 philanthropic agencies, foundations across the state to really come together and work towards creating a Kentucky that, we don't have adversity, childhood adversity. And so we do this by exactly this, right? We're trying to address some of these root causes of adverse childhood experiences. So Bloom created this infographic that Crystal handed out to you, and this is some of the most up-to-date data on what adversities specifically Kentucky kids are experiencing. So I wanted to let me grab one of those, Crystal, because I wanted to go over a couple. And I'm sorry that I did not think about having one for you all in the Zoom, but I can make sure that we maybe can send that and follow up. But a couple of key pieces of data, and you'll also notice that this infographic really mirrors Dr. Ellis's really visual of the adverse community environments. So up at the top are some of those ACEs, right? And some of the statistics that we have around those. I will just mention that Kentucky is ranked 5th in child maltreatment. That is not a good thing. We were once ranked 1st, so I think we're seeing some progress. But we have a real issue and a real challenge here in our state about addressing child maltreatment, and that includes abuse and neglect. So you'll see some pretty staggering numbers on here around that. We also have 27% of Kentucky's kids have experienced parental divorce. 6% of Kentucky's kids have witnessed domestic violence, and 10% of Kentucky's kids have lived with anyone with with a problem with alcohol or drugs. So these are a few key things that we experience, that we have here in Kentucky. And then I will also just say, down here in the bottom portion of this infographic are some of those, really tackle some of those adverse community experiences. So 5% of Kentucky adults are unemployed. 43% of Kentucky households that rent their homes have to spend more than 30% of their income on housing. So just really goes back to showing how some of the environments that kids are being raised in right now and parents and caregivers are operating in really have the potential to create these instances of adverse childhood experiences. And then I will just say on this data point, while in that original study, 64% of Americans had at least one ACE, here in Kentucky, 64% of Kentuckians have 2 ACEs. So clearly we have an issue around adversity here in Kentucky. Some of the most common ACEs in Kentucky, child abuse, as I mentioned, 5th, we rank 5th in the nation per capita of child maltreatment, divorce, incarcerated relative, and then substance abuse as well. We know that the opioid epidemic especially hit Kentucky hard, and so we're continuing to see some of those outcomes as more data is coming to light. Over the next several decades, we'll continue to see that, I think. So what does this look like? So these are some of the problems that are often linked to adverse childhood experiences. I will say that this list is not exhaustive, nor does this list represent everyone's experience. I think really what we're trying to do here is make sure that folks are aware of what trauma and the impact of trauma might look like in a kid or in an adult, so that we can come prepared to recognize it and to help them and support them as they repair. Now, I also want to point out that some of these might seem a little contradictory, right? So we have hyperarousal and sleeping difficulties, but also tired and sleepy as 2 different potential challenges that folks might experience. And I think that just goes to show us that really folks respond to trauma and adversity in different ways. And so it's important for us to really notice these things, and especially notice any kind of behaviors that are a little bit outside of the norm of that child or that adult who we might be supporting, so that we can help kind of identify and address what's going on there. So it's not enough to know about ACEs and trauma. we also really have to make that shift in our perspective, in our mindset about trauma, to really embody this notion of trauma-informed care. And I'm sure this is something that you all have, this term trauma-informed care has kind of been thrown around a lot in the last decade or so. But at the heart of it, trauma-informed care is really about taking this universal precaution, right? Of understanding that most people probably show up in whatever space. Oh, I've got some, thank you. Allergies. Show up in whatever space they're showing up in, having experienced trauma in some sort of way. And so when we're seeing, especially when we're seeing challenging behaviors in kids or adults or families, instead of asking what is wrong with this kid, it's really asking what has happened to this kid. If a child shows up in a classroom and they're throwing chairs and they're just like really having difficulty with emotion regulation, instead of saying what is wrong with her, let's ask what is happening in her life that is causing this. And it's taking a step further. Like once we figured this out or start to really dive into that question, it's figuring out how we can support her and trying to build resilience in her to kind of overcome whatever adversity she's facing. And, I think it's really tempting for us to see people who have challenging behaviors as bad people, or, because maybe that their behaviors are an inconvenience to us. Sometimes it can cause distress to others. Obviously, a child throwing a chair is a safety concern and needs to be addressed. But at the heart of it, we really need to be asking what's going on in this child's life. And especially because when we ask that question, it allows us to really lean in and support that person rather than taking perhaps a more punitive approach, removing her from the classroom or whatever that might look like, that is really just going to re-traumatize her and not really help the situation at all. So when a traumatic experience is experienced, I think there are really there are two pathways, and I would even argue there are three pathways that can be taken when trauma is experienced, and that's stagnation or growth, or even a combination of the two. And I think what really determines what pathway we go down and what pathway our clients go down is what kind of buffer and support that they have. So you might, there have been I've heard Oprah stories of kids during those very formative years of a lot of brain development, like 0 to 5, who experience some kind of very large, adversity within those years. And it can really delay their brain development, right? And so that's an example of stagnation. And that's not always going to happen, but especially without those buffers and without support to help work through some of those issues, that is very possible. On the flip side of things, there's also this thing called post-traumatic growth. And it's really identifying what we've learned about ourselves and emboldening folks to really grow from that experience. Now, I'm not suggesting that trauma or ACEs are good for kids. That's not at all what we're suggesting. Just really acknowledging that trauma is very common, and this idea of resilience and post-traumatic growth can be a really empowering opportunity for people to really, kind of choose how they want to overcome this. One of my favorite people, she's a fellow social worker, is Brene Brown. And she has a quote that says, "We cannot selectively numb emotions. And when we numb the painful emotions, we also numb the positive ones." So it's really important for us to help our clients and help the folks that we support, whether that's personally or professionally, to experience and sit with the emotions that come with trauma, so that they can process those and move on. The great news is that, whenever a traumatic experience is experienced, there is an antidote, right? There's something that we can do about it. and the answer really is resilience. Now, I will say that I've had this conversation with lots of folks. There's a colleague of mine on my team that has been in the foster care system. She's an alumni of the foster care system here in Kentucky, and she hates the word resilience. She feels like it's a backhanded compliment, and I'm sure that is a very real experience of hers, where people will come and compliment her for her resilience. She's overcome so much. And her argument is, why did I have to overcome so much? Why can't we fix the systems that made me, that put me in this situation in the first place? And she has a very valid point. I've also heard the same arguments from folk, like marginalized folks, who also have to have extra resilience built up because of the adversity they're experiencing. And those are all very true, very valid. I think the concept of resilience can be especially overwhelming because the more trauma that is experienced by an individual, the more resilience they have to build. So that's really hard, right? But as I said, I think it can really be empowering concept to help a person really see how much strength they already have, and that they have survived it, that they continue to survive it, and that resilience is really maybe the key that can help them go from surviving to thriving. So again, just, a couple of things that we know. ACEs are common. ACEs have lifelong impacts in a lot of different ways, but there are steps that we can take to reduce those impacts and make sure that Kentuckians grow up to be healthy and hopeful. And that's really what at the heart of what Bounce Coalition does. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. But in a nutshell, the good news is that trauma does not define our destiny. We have the opportunity and we have the space to be able to overcome that and build resilience. A couple of things. Studies show that children who've learned resiliency skills, or sometimes folks will also interchange social emotional learning skills, they are 3 times more likely to be engaged in school than their peers who have not learned these skills. There's also been studies, I find this really interesting. There have also been studies that show that individuals with high ACE scores, but sufficient support to help them overcome that and help buffer that, can have less risk for those negative outcomes that we've talked about than individuals with low ACE scores and no support. So even folks who have a lot of adversity in their lifetime, if they have that support and they have that buffering, then they're able to really overcome those. And when it comes to the, what does resilience look like? The 4 R's of building resilience is really like the paradigm for how we build resilience. The Bounce Coalition, we host a lot of different trainings. Our Bounce 102, which kind of is, what I've talked about so far is more of I've taken from our Bounce 101 training. Our Bounce 102 really dives into the specific strategies to building resilience personally, and like in your profession, helping other folks do that as well. But this is really the paradigm of what resilience building looks like for us. So the first is realizing the spread of widespread impact of stress and trauma. And really that's just educating folks, right? Making sure folks understand that trauma exists, that trauma impacts our behaviors and our outcomes. And that folks, especially folks in the helping profession, really need to be on the lookout for those things. Recognizing the signs and symptoms, again, what we talked about, understanding that it doesn't look the same for everybody, but that there are some key clues that we can really look at to understand what's happening in a child's life, to help us better support them. Responding, so maybe this is responding in the way that we interact with that person, with that child. Maybe it's responding with policies and procedures within our organization, within our state, to help address that legislation, and just really practices to build resilience. So it's not just responding in a way that is compassionate and understanding, but it's also helping that child or helping that family really start to develop some resilience. I'm sorry, my allergies are really flaring up right now. And then the final one is resisting re-traumatization. As I talked about, a lot of punitive approaches to dealing with challenging behaviors are just re-traumatizing. Kentucky is one of very few states in the United States that still allow corporal punishment in schools. It doesn't happen often, but there are some states that, or some counties that still report incidences of corporal punishment each year. And so that's something that we always try to advocate for, is that corporal punishment does not belong in the school, in the educational system. But that's just an example of how those punitive responses or punishments are not as effective as we think they might be, because they are also re-traumatizing. So I want to talk a little bit about Bounce and specifically what we do. So as I talked about, we build the resilience of Kentucky's folks by improving knowledge about ACEs, helping folks understand the impact of ACEs, and then also trying to build skills in people to help them bounce back from adversity. So we do this a couple different ways. One is our education and training. We have a whole host of trainings that we offer for professionals, for parents and caregivers. We've even started to do some resilience building and social emotional learning programming with kids. So we also provide evaluation services. So we have a long history of being able to really track our outcomes of our trainings, and especially for those organizations and schools that we work with for long periods of time. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of those outcomes we've seen. And then advocating for organizational policies and legislation that support people who've experienced trauma. So we do that by promoting, engaging in technical assistance with organizations, help working with their board on creating policies that are trauma informed. We also obviously cross over with Bloom Kentucky a lot as well. So a really quick history of Bounce. It started, we're almost a decade old now. It started in 2014 with a pilot project in Jefferson County Public Schools. This was funded by the Foundation for a Healthy Kentucky. And in this pilot project, we had the opportunity to originally work with one JCPS school. We had another school that was like our control school. And then after the first year, we added 2 additional schools because we had already started to see some really great progress. So all in all, we worked with 3 intervention schools in JCPS, and they were all elementary schools. Provided training and technical assistance to the staff, to their leadership, 2 full years of all of this. Did parent and caregiver trainings, did a lot of technical assistance, so helping them, especially within their multi-tiered system of support, where, kids who are in that tier 3 who really need extra supports, we would come in and provide consultation around those. And then we also had some, we know that trauma does not exist in a vacuum. Kids don't just show up at school with challenging behaviors due to their trauma. They're also out in the community, right? They're also at home with their parents. So we wanted to make sure that a lot of how, that trauma-informed approach that they were getting at school was also carrying over into other spaces as well. So we worked with the YMCA of Greater Louisville, which has a lot of the after-school programs within JCPS. We were able to train 1,000 of their staff. We did parent lunch and learns at those schools. Really got parents to better understand intergenerational trauma and how that shows up in the way that we parent. We also did some community screenings of Resilience, the Biology of Stress and Science of Hope. It's a really great, about 60-minute documentary. If you haven't seen it, it really outlines the genesis of ACEs and also some really practical, like what does this look like in the community. And then we also, during this pilot work, initiated our bounce grand rounds that we've continued since then, where we bring together folks from multi-sectors, at that time just in Louisville, and really talked about kind of grand rounds in the medical sense, where we had like a case study and folks really weighed in with their expertise, whether that was more clinical expertise, medical expertise, educational expertise, whatever that looked like. Well, hold on, let me get some of these pulled up. We saw some really great outcomes after the first 2 years with each of these schools. So we saw a reduction in the out-of-school suspensions. We saw increase in teacher retention, so less turnover among our intervention schools. Improved staff perception of skills, so they felt like they were better prepared to support kids who had experienced trauma. Improved student climate survey, so we do surveys of students and ask how they feel about their schools. It measures on their sense of belonging, caring, and one other, inclusion. And we saw improved results on that survey as well. And then we saw increased parent engagement. Parent conferences jumped 195%. We had one school that had 0 parents in the PTA when we started and had 110 by the time we finished. So really great parent engagement after that. And I will just say, since then, we have really, over the last decade or so, tried to reach out throughout the state. So Bounce started in Louisville, Jefferson County, but we know that this is not something that is just particular to Jefferson County, and that adversity happens in childhood for all of kids across Kentucky. So sorry. So we knew that we wanted to get into counties. So we've now been in 63 Kentucky counties where we've done any kind of training or educational opportunity or technical assistance. So the areas in blue are where we've been. Obviously, we have some work to do in Eastern Kentucky, but ideally, in the next decade or so, we'd love to see this entire map blue. And then I will also say, although we started in the school system, and that's still very much our bread and butter. I think we have a lot of folks on our executive committee and many of our trainers that have that expertise. We have also branched out into other sectors. So we've done, obviously, Jefferson County, we've done a couple of different rural school districts. We're in Fayette County, one elementary school in Fayette County, and we're starting to branch out into Estill County as well. We've worked in some private schools. We've done a lot of work extensively with some of the educational cooperatives across the state. We've completed a 2-year project with some residential facilities in Louisville. We are in our 3rd iteration of a project to really serve Louisville's youth serving organizations and make sure that they're trauma informed and have the skills and tools that they need to support the young people that they serve. We've worked in health departments, managed care organizations, government departments. We've also really started, as I mentioned, beefing up our work with parents and caregivers, especially like foster parents, kinship caregivers. We've worked in hospitals. And then the one thing, like I mentioned, that we've been doing just over the last, we actually just received a grant earlier this fall that allows us, it's from the Department for Health and Human Services, that allows us to provide some social emotional learning and resilience building programming to some of the kids supported by the YMCA of Greater Louisville. So we'll get to pilot that. Really excited about that. So these are some of our trainings. some of what I've talked to you all about today is what's in our Bounce 101, which is really just an intro to all of this, intro to ACEs and trauma-informed care. Our Bounce 102 is, I think, where folks really get engaged and interested. It's tangible strategies on how to build resilience, and there's practice within each of those. You'll do gratitude practices, you'll do what we call the HEAL method, and so each of those you get to kind of practice along the way as well. We also have Bounce 103, which is building trauma-informed organizations. That's a training that's specific for organizational leadership and board members to really help think through and provide some TA around what do trauma-informed organizational policies look like, and how can we make sure that this trauma awareness is really at the forefront of all of our decisions as leadership. We also have some supplemental staff training, so different topics, self-care, racial trauma and healing. That's a really great training that we've gotten some great feedback on. Resilience building and strategy practice, effective problem-solving teams and de-escalation strategies. Also, some of our parent and caregiver engagement opportunities. And then our Bounce University is our train the trainer opportunity. So organizations that are really interested in making our Bounce trainings part of their standard staff training curriculum have the opportunity to become Bounce trainers. So that way they don't have to call on us every time they're wanting to train new staff and that kind of thing. As I mentioned, we also provide technical assistance. So that includes evaluation services. So we've got two instruments that we utilize to assess for growth on organizations' journeys to becoming trauma-informed. So our organizational readiness assessment and also our culture and climate survey that I mentioned. We also provide all kinds of different types of technical assistance. Some of it just might not be on this list because we fill a need or kind of make it up as we go based on what the needs are of the organization. But some of the things we've done in the past, monthly consultations with role groups. So sometimes we'll have some providers that might want to have consultations with our trainers, or especially school personnel really take us up on that one. Goal setting with organizations. And so we might look at their evaluation data and help them to set some goals around that, and action planning, capacity building for employees, even developing trauma-informed orientations for new employees. We might, for a couple of organizations in Louisville, we've developed some kind of quick 30-minute videos to give to folks right as they're starting and onboarding with an organization, just to kind of get a little glimpse of ACEs and that trauma-informed care as they're starting their new positions. And then I also mentioned our Bounce Grand Rounds. We've continued those since the original pilot project that we did. So this is really an opportunity. Of course, we had to move these virtual during the pandemic, but that allowed us to really reach out across the state. We have folks from all across the state and some even outside of the state that join us we do this twice a year. And we have different topics. So the one we did in the spring was addressing secondary and vicarious trauma. We had a really good one in the last fall around school safety. We had some folks from Sandy Hook Promise that came and spoke. This one we just did last week was around kind of going back to the basics, sort of what's the biology of stress? What does that look like in the brain? And then we had a guest speaker, someone with lived experience with trauma, childhood trauma, come and talk about what that looks like for her. So we had a really great turnout, over 100 folks joined. And with every one of these, what we do is they're all free. So definitely check those out on our webpage. But it's an opportunity for folks to learn something about trauma or resilience building, And then we spend a good chunk of the time doing breakout groups and discussions, and it's an opportunity to kind of foster that cross-sector collaboration and learning in that way. So check us out on that one. That one's a free opportunity. So I'll just end there. I don't know if there are any questions or anything, but this is our contact information. Feel free to check us out at bouncecoalition.org. You can find more description on some of our trainings and some of the offerings that we have, but any questions? I apologize for the, my allergies just started acting up.
Any
as soon as I
questions?
set up here.
There's a comment from
Sure.
the online chat, Marcy Timmerman from Mental Health America, Kentucky. She just wanted to mention that there's a youth mental health first aid course coming up in November that specifically outlines noticing changes as a way to identify early signs and symptoms of mental health concerns. And you can find information about that event at mhaky.org under the events tab. And then also the Mental Health America, Northern Kentucky and Southwestern Ohio has a free youth mental health first aid training coming up also.
That's awesome. Yeah. Hey, Marcy. Good to hear from you. Yeah, that's a really good opportunity for sure. I have not gotten to go through mental health first aid, but heard folks that have. Yeah.
Okay.
Anything else?
Okay.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you for inviting us. Appreciate you all.
Well, thank you for coming today.
Yeah.
Thank you.